This presentation is about pollinators, and it is part of Dinya Wahda. Let me start with a question. If you saw cereal in a box like this, would you buy it? Now, how about this box? If you had to choose between these two boxes and you knew that inside they were exactly the same, which box would you choose? I would choose the one on the right. I mean, look at those colors. Lovely, right? You simply can't stay away from it. Now, this is a trick that plants use to get insects to do what they want them to do. Follow me, and I'll show you what I mean. Plants have a very important dust called pollen. They use this pollen when they want to make young plants. To do that, one plant needs to pass its pollen to another one like it. But unlike the cartoon in this picture, plants can't just walk over to their neighbor and give them their pollen, can they? Because plants' feet are in the ground to hold them in the soil. They're called roots. And you know that a plant can't take its root out of the ground and walk on them. Wouldn't that be funny? So how on earth is a plant going to take its pollen to another plant and get the other plant's pollen? They have to be clever and make somebody do it for them. And plants have just the right idea how to do this. Insects. They use insects. Many insects are small and pretty and have all sorts of colors. But most important of all, insects have wings and they can fly. So how are plants going to get insects to fly from one plant to another for them? Well, do you remember the cereal box trick? And how we would choose the one in the colored box because it looks better? Well, plants use exactly the same trick that people use when they want buyers to buy their products. They use colors. And my goodness, what colors! And in all different shapes and sizes. Insects see them from far away and they simply have to visit these beautiful colors. Yes, all right. But what will make an insect take the pollen from inside the flower and give it to the next flower? Well, the answer is in the pollen. Pollen is a delicious food and insects love it. Many insects feed pollen to their young, just like this bumblebee. But wait a minute. The plant, the flower, doesn't want the insect to eat all its pollen. It needs the insect to carry some of its pollen to other plants. And they have another trick for that. You see, pollen is very sticky. You can see the pollen dust sticking to those little finger-like things in the middle of this pink flower. Insects are very hairy, like this bee. Can you guess what happens? You guessed, it sticks to the insect's body, to the back or legs or head, and it stays on until it visits another flower for more pollen. Just look at how this carpenter bee is full of yellow pollen from head to toe. Even its wings are covered in pollen. When it gets there, some pollen falls off onto the second flower. And here, the plant has tricked the insect into carrying its pollen to other plants for it. Now, why does the plant need that pollen anyway? Let me show you in a cartoon. So here we have the flower. Beautiful colors. Insect sees the color, can't help it. It goes down to eat the pollen. But you can see that this little bee's body is covered in pollen. So when it lands and starts to eat pollen from this flower, some of the pollen that was sticking to its body from the flower before it drops off. And when the bee flies away, some of that pollen stays on the new flower. This is called pollination, and the insects that do it are pollinators. Have a look at this pollinator. It's a honeybee and it's going from flower to flower, eating pollen and drinking nectar. And what's more, it's got pockets on its legs just like shopping bags. It fills these bags with extra pollen. There, look how it's packing them. And then it will take this extra pollen to feed its young. At the same time, its back fills with pollen, which it will drop off onto the next group of flowers. Now look what happens to that pollen. It goes inside the flower and the flower starts changing. It drops its petals and seeds grow inside it. When the seeds are ready, you can see them. Sometimes the seeds are inside like a fruit, just like an apple, for example, and sometimes they're inside like a vegetable, like beans. People eat fruit and vegetables, and this is why people need pollinators. You see, only those flowers that get pollen from another flower will turn into seeds or fruit or nuts. Pollinators make your food happen. And just to make sure that the pollinators come to take their pollen, plants have another trick. They make nectar, especially for pollinators. Nectar is a delicious drink of sugar and water that gives insect pollinators energy. Just look at how this butterfly is sticking its tongue there, right into these flowers and drinking up the nectar. A butterfly has a long tongue like a straw. When it's not using it, it curls it up under its chin. And just in case this wasn't enough to make sure insects visit their flowers, many plants have another trick: scent. That lovely perfume flowers make that carries on the air and tells all passing insects, "Come to the party." So, who are these pollinators? The first one that everyone thinks of is bees, because bees make honey and people eat honey. But did you know that there are many kinds of bees? Take a look at all these different types. Can you see that they are all very hairy and have soft bodies? They are usually brown or black with yellow. These are beetles. A beetle is also a pollinator. Look how these beetles' bodies covered in pollen. It's sticking to the hair all over their body and legs. Many kinds of beetles pollinate flowers. Some of these are bugs. Bugs are hard on the outside and have different colors. Many of them are shiny. These beetles are eating pollen, and the pollen sticks to the hair on their legs and sometimes onto their back, if this is hairy. This is a wasp. Can you see its black and yellow stripes? This is how you can tell a wasp from a bee. A wasp doesn't have as much hair on its body as bees do, but they do love eating pollen. When bees and wasps are flying around flowers, there's nothing for you to be afraid of. All they want is a tasty snack. Pollinators even get tired like people do, and they stop for a bit of a rest now and again, like this wasp. They certainly don't want to sting you. Just make sure you leave them alone, and they will be very happy to go on pollinating flowers. Have you ever seen this butterfly? It's called a cabbage white. Can you see its hairy legs and body? You got it. That's what picks up the pollen when the butterfly is visiting flowers. Butterflies have a special way of getting nectar from flowers. We've seen this before. Their tongue is a very long tube, like a straw. They dip it into the middle of a flower to suck up nectar. When they're not using their tongue, they just curl it up under their face. Butterflies pay for their free meal by dropping pollen from another flower onto this flower. And there are many kinds of butterflies too. But all of these butterflies have big, soft wings and bright colors. It's easy to see a butterfly because most of them are bigger than beetles. Flies are good pollinators too. Can you see the pollen on this fly's back? There are many kinds of flies, not just the ones you see inside our homes. You can tell flies from other pollinators because they have big eyes, see-through wings, and their bodies come in different colors too. Can you see pollen on the face and legs of the fly in the middle as it eats pollen with its long tongue? Do you know which season is best for pollinators? Well, of course, it's the season when there are most flowers. Spring. Insects and plants need each other. In winter, most plants do not make flowers, so there is no food for insects and they have nothing to pollinate. In spring, there are many insects. Plants and insects work so well together that some plants prefer some insects more than others. Take, for example, this blue flower. It's called borage. In this little cartoon sequence, we can see how honeybees and borage work together. The honeybee knows that to get at the nectar, it needs to press a pedal. There. When it presses down on it, the middle of the flower opens up and the bee can drink the honey. That's because the bee knows the trick of the borage flower. Here's another trick. This trick is to make sure that the pollinator really gets full of pollen. Then it can carry this pollen to another flower. The nectar is deep inside the flower, and to get at it, this bee needs to push under that purple bit, like a lid on the flower. There. See how it gets inside? That purple bit is full of pollen on the underside. So when the bee goes inside, it comes out full of that yellow pollen. Of course, plants learn these tricks over millions of years. The first plants used the wind to carry their pollen to each other. But this wasn't a very good way, because a lot of pollen is wasted, because it doesn't fall on the right plant. So they started to learn to trick insects instead. Today, there are still many plants that use the wind to carry their pollen. This is what they look like. Do you notice something? Did you notice that they're not big and bright and round and with a lot of colors? Why not? You now know that these plants don't have big colors because they don't need insects to see them. So they don't bother making flowers with colors, nectar, and scent for pollinators. Now you know all about pollinators and wildflowers and how they need each other. Dinja waħda loves nature. Are you a dinja waħda fan?